Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, and welcome to another LinkedIn Live with me, Laurie Keogh. We are fortunate as ever to have a fantastic human being with us today, and that is Mr. Dave Cook. Dave, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Hey, I'm super, thanks for asking. So for folks who are dialing in and watching, so a little bit of context on Dave. Dave is an anthropologist with University College London, and also has his own design studio. Dave, I guess the first question that I have for people who aren't familiar with anthropology, could you describe what anthropology is?
Yeah, so anthropology is a type of social science, and it differs from other social sciences. Mainly, it's about understanding how communities and a culture works. So, an anthropologist will go to a place and immerse themselves in that culture for at least a year. That's the traditional path.
And then thank you for kind of setting that scene before we jump into, I think if we had that at the start, then we can understand perhaps a little bit more about you. So moving on to that, in terms of, if you wouldn't mind just explaining a little bit about who you are, where you're based, and your career to date, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, so, well, as you just mentioned, I'm an anthropologist, and I think the reason why I'm on here today is that I'm conducting a 7-year study on digital nomads. And just to explain, they're, what I call an extreme type of remote worker. And on this study, which has been going for 5 years now, I've been conducting research in Thailand, specifically co-working spaces, and looking at how this remote work experience works for them. And as I said, it's been 5 years, and I think one of the unique aspects of this research is that I've got 5 years of data tracking people over time. So I've got an understanding about how people adapt to the remote work experience over months and years. And then just to add, at the beginning of lockdown, I found that my research became more relevant than ever. And I was asked to join forces with psychologists in the UCL Brain Sciences faculty to research the experience of suddenly working from home during the pandemic. And that's the eworklife.co.uk project. And we can talk a little bit about that today. And I'm also co-founder of the design consultancy What People Want, which has been going for about 18 years now.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's obviously working if things are going on for that long, which is great. Congratulations. In terms then of, I guess, where I came across Dave yourself was in the article, in the conversation. And it was 5 workplace trends that will shape life after lockdown. And I'll put the link to that in the chat so people can look at it. But I actually saw, I think it was somebody from Accenture who posted about it. And then I read it and I thought it was, well, that was really interesting. I thought it was insightful. And that was why I reached out to you. So for the folks who haven't read that article, would you mind sharing what the key takeaways were from that article?
Yeah, sure. That must have been shared by Mark Curtis, so it sounds like him. So a big shout out to Mark. Thanks very much for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, that article was actually following another article, which I was talking about this experience of working remotely, for a long period of time. What I was saying in this 5 workplace trends article, I was speculating actually about the future, based on what I'd learned in my research. And, I was kind of like talking about the fact that in this novel phase of working remotely from home, nobody was missing commuting. I think the genie is out of the bottle on that one. And I was also talking about email and Zoom practices. I think people were very excited to be able to work from home initially. And then, some people were certainly reporting that they felt that they were working all the time. So this kind of, excitement about working from home, suddenly it wasn't all very, very perfect. And then I was looking at what would happen when lockdown finishes. And I think one of the things that we're finding at the moment is the long tail out of lockdown is taking a very long time. We were going to talk about 6 weeks ago, and we kind of like thought it would be really relevant then, but I think it's just as relevant now. I was talking about how where people are going to work when lockdown finishes, if they're not going to be doing long commutes into the office. I was speculating that they might be working in co-working spaces that were nearer to home. That isn't available to people yet, but that was one of the things that I was speaking about. And I was also then looking at the research I've done into digital nomads, and digital nomads are moving and working at the same time instead of kind of like traveling to go to work, if that makes sense. And I was suggesting that this might affect how town centres are designed, where people are going to work, whether they're going to stay in cities, whether they're going to become slightly nomadic once this connection between a physical office and commuting is broken. Yeah, those are a few of the points that I was talking about there.
So to drill down, just certainly in a couple of them, but so commuting will change forever. So as you said, the genie's out of the bottle. No one likes commuting. Is that really the bottom line there? And therefore, the basic offering that a company will be providing is that you will have the option to work from home 3 days a week or for all the time. Is that what you really see happening there?
Okay, so in the research that I've been doing during lockdown with UCL, I've been doing 1 hour interviews with people speaking about their experience working from home. And at the end of those interviews, we were talking about people's Nirvana experience, and pretty, some people veer more on the side of wanting to work from home completely, and some people want to completely go back into the office. But the majority of people that I've been speaking to have been saying that they wanted a hybrid strategy. So the most common pattern has been 3 days in the office and 2 days working from home, and having a bit of flexibility. I think the challenge for HR departments going forward is managing how that works in reality, because if people want to go back into the office so they can have in-person interactions, it's not really going to work if half the workforce are at home and they're having to do Zoom calls and they're not able to have meetings. So it's how to get those people in sync. And I know that is a problem, because when I've been doing my research into digital nomads, they're working in Thailand, often working with people in San Francisco, Berlin and London, and they're working across time zones, and they're finding those out of sync experiences less than perfect, I have to say.
Okay. And in terms of another point there that you mentioned was in relation to kind of bad email etiquette. Can you talk a little bit more about that so people understand?
Yeah, so during lockdown, the whole idea of sort of like doing Zoom calls and sort of like having completely professional space behind you has been broken. We've all had toddler tantrums, we've seen caring responsibilities and all of that kind of stuff. One of the things that I started to see during lockdown, people were putting stuff on their email signatures, kind of like telling people when they were working, when they would respond. The idea that when I work isn't necessarily the time that that you're going to work, and so people are having to have this conversation about the right to switch off, and when to send emails or when to expect a response. And of course, the French, sort of like pioneered this conversation when they brought in legislation in 2016, kind of like saying that people, should have the right to be able to switch off. So I think going forward, how this is managed is going to be quite interesting and quite complex, because if you kind of like think about parents who are having to, deal with homeschooling, and having to spend time with toddlers during the day, they need to send emails outside of work hours. So it's really important that teams and departments don't just kind of like set policies. They talk about the guidelines and how they're going to enact them, and there's a lot of work going on in lots of companies around that topic.
Okay, so I guess flexibility is really important on that one.
Yeah, and the idea that my flexibility isn't your flexibility, then that's okay.
Yes.
And how do we manage that? I mean, I think we're going to kind of like see examples of really good employers that are able to have these conversations, and some employers are going to struggle because they don't have the infrastructure, and some employers are just going to be less sympathetic to their workers. I mean, that's always going to be the case. So there's going to be a separation.
And I've had numerous conversations with people about how some of them I guess, are feeling more tired than ever, based on the fact that what they're doing, what we're doing right now, except it's for almost 9 hours or 8 hours continuously, and that is video calls just all day, every day, whether it's Zoom, Teams, Hangouts, whatever. So you think, or you propose, that really video calls should be limited?
Yeah, I mean, what I was saying in the article there was, I think they will end up being more limited once we come out of lockdown, purely and simply because, people are finding them really draining, and especially in some of, some of those organizations where people do need to collaborate, a lot. Some people are finding that they're doing up to 8 hours of Zoom calls on some occasions. And so there is research that shows that if you're on a Zoom call, even if the lag or the Wi-Fi is giving it a millisecond worth of delay, people think that people aren't properly listening or responding to them. So it creates a feeling of slightly less trust. So those things can escalate over time. And Zoom calls are very, very important during lockdown because they are what I call a synchronous form of communication, which are really important because sometimes if there's a difficult aspect, a difficult decision that needs to be made, and it's all done by email or by Slack or via a messaging platform, something that is aggravating to one person can soon escalate into a full-blown issue. And so Zoom calls are better for bringing people together and coming to a decision. They're not just going on and on and on, but they are draining, and I think we will find that employers are having policies about how many Zoom calls you should be having. I mean, let's face it, before lockdown, people were complaining about meeting culture in some companies and having meetings for the sake of meetings. So we're just going to take that, to the digital world and kind of like see, what kind of impact, does it have? Okay.
That makes sense. And then another area that you touched on as well, which was more co-working spaces will emerge. And I know we spoke about this previously as well. And I think for me, this is a really interesting idea. And when we spoke, it wasn't necessarily more WeWorks, it was more community-based co-working spaces. Could you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, in the research that I've been doing with digital nomads in places like Chiang Mai and Thailand and in other places, the co-working spaces where I've been doing research are small businesses. So they are kind of like, like smaller scale, different to the kind of like the WeWork model, which, I mean, I don't know if, WeWork going to be changing their business model, but they're not so different to a updated, version of a serviced office. They're still leasing to really big companies. And there are, lots of co-working spaces in places like Berlin and London, New York and San Francisco. So, and they're not just, in the center of town. You do have them in, sort of like neighborhoods where people live. So in the absence of, people commuting, and people finding that, you know, sitting at home and working and then having all your leisure time in the same space becoming a little bit draining. You know, that does become a little bit like drudgery over time for some people. I can see a future scenario, you know, sort of like post social distancing, where, you know, these places may have their day. I think one of the things that we're finding is that we're coming out of lockdown much more slowly than we initially thought. When we originally thought that we were going to be working from home, everyone was talking about 12 weeks. And then at the beginning, you know, most of us did think that we were going to go back to the office. It's going to be interesting to see, you know, if some of these small businesses, the ones that survive, you know, how they're going to do after this. But I think that those co-working spaces are only going to become relevant in a few months' time, maybe longer, because yeah, we just don't know when certain types of businesses, like, you know, gyms and yoga studios and those kind of things, are going to open at the moment.
So I guess, yeah, so what do you see happening to WeWork and bigger entities like that?
I'm not sure. I mean, I did see an ad on Facebook from WeWork, you know, kind of like suggesting that they would offer their services as local hubs, so that people could go in and then connect with their teams. You know, and WeWork, you know, have, you know, different locations, multiple locations in most cities. They're trying to pivot around that model at the moment, you know, to allow people to have distributed teams, because I think people are kind of like realizing that, you know, working from home has its limitations. Yeah, I know some employers, you know, are providing monitors and keyboards, and, you know, some of the bigger Silicon Valley companies are probably going to be providing, you know, ergonomic chairs and stuff like that. But in the absence of that, I think there is a role that WeWork could play in, you know, allowing people to more effectively connect with their teams without traveling, you know, all the way across London, if that's what their commute is.
And then in terms of, and I know you touched on this a moment ago, but in terms of, let's say, I guess, community-based co-working spaces. So this is for people who, you know, go to their local village, as a place may be. So they're not going into the city, they're going to their nearest town. There is a place for them to get out of the house, to be around other people, but it is very much a community-driven co-working space. Is that really the thought process there?
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll just explain a little bit about what I've observed happening in my research with digital nomads. Co-working spaces are quite a curious thing, because if you kind of have a co-working space and say it's kind of, you know, got 30 hot desk seats, and that's full of people, it's most likely that people are all going to be working in different roles and in different businesses. So if you go to a co-working space in Thailand, where I'm doing my research, that is exactly the case. So you'll have a graphic designer, a book editor, a journalist, a computer coder, just to kind of give you a few examples of the kind of job types. And they have nothing in common in terms of their community of practice. And I found this curious, and I just kept on asking people, you know, why are you going, you know, to a co-working space? You know, you've become a digital nomad, you travel halfway across the world so that you can escape the commute, the 9 to 5 and the office, and you end up going into an office. I really did find that curious, and that kind of like became a big research question for me, to try and understand why this was happening. And then, you know, because I thought that there must be something community-based behind them wanting to go into a co-working space. And the answer that I kept on getting back time after time is, I just want to be around other people that are working. And you know, that's pretty much it. There are no lateral communications going on in terms of, you know, their day jobs in these co-working space, but there is some kind of comfort into being in a place which is separate to your Airbnb or your apartment, And one of the things that one research participant said to me about 3 years ago, which I thought was the most absurd thing I had ever heard in my life, was I go into the co-working space because I find it really hard to be disciplined in my Airbnb. You know, I get cabin fever, so I'm outsourcing my discipline to the co-working space. And when I heard that, I thought that was an insane thing to say, but that makes absolute sense. Now I've experienced lockdown. I can empathize with that. You know, so seeing co-working spaces almost as a technology that you would outsource, you know, your discipline and your focus and your productivity to, I think was really curious when I heard it. And yeah, it makes sense now. And there's this, there's even a term for it. It's called co-presence. It's a psychology term. So you just being around people doing something similar can feel regulating in some way.
Okay. And even motivating, like, so that you're, you know, if you see somebody working hard, do you then work hard? Is it that concept?
Yeah, so the other thing that really confused me about co-working spaces when I started researching them in Thailand is I made the presumption that they would be community-based. And, you know, people do go out for lunch and, you know, they do make connections over time. But people are quite transient in these places, so they don't always. And yeah, so it's about momentum, I think, and just being around people that are working. The thing that really struck me when I went into co-working spaces in Thailand is that they were like university libraries. They were really quiet. There wasn't, you know, it's not okay to have an out loud conversation on your telephone. You have to leave the space. It's exactly like a library. And I really didn't understand what was going on there for the first year. I was really, really confused. That's what anthropology is about. You go and you kind of like see what's going on. You kind of like say, why is that happening? And you don't get the answer. You don't, you know, you don't start going interviewing people saying, why is it so quiet? You just let it come out in conversations and you see, you know, what's occurring. And that was my first big finding.
Okay.
It was quiet, but people just wanted to be around other people that are working.
Okay, thank you for that. So, Colin Duggan, thanks for the comment. So, it makes complete sense on having others around. I could never study in uni unless I was in the library. Yeah, keeping you sane, keeping you distracted at the same time. I'll definitely say that. Okay, and then the last thing you said there was in relation to digital nomads, and this is that kind of concept that you're talking about. So, people, I guess, going to Thailand. So they're not in the rat race, but then, as you mentioned there, they drift back into habits that they wanted to get away from in order to have some belonging, some structure.
Yeah. I mean, in the paper that I just published, actually, I ended it by kind of like saying that digital nomads, you know, that they have these utopian dreams, they travel across the world, you know, they talk a lot about rejecting all of these workplace obligations, the office, commuting, and then they end up reformatting them. And, you know, I kind of like said at the end of that article that, you know, it's really interesting to, you know, kind of like understand what they're really escaping and what they're taking with them. And what they're taking with them, or what emerges over time, is that they're talking about attaining this new sense of freedom, but they end up having to be extremely disciplined about it if it's going to work for them, if they're going to kind of like integrate you know, this life of leisure, going to Thailand and integrating their work life. And I think that this is why people at the beginning of lockdown, you know, a lot of people were quite curious about what the remote work experience would be like. You know, it was only about 5% of people that were working remotely all the time, you know, depending on which country, but it was quite a low percentage, and that went to way over 50% and during lockdown. And people were anxious when that happened, but a lot of people were kind of excited and curious at the beginning. And I think the challenge that people have found during lockdown is they're not integrating their work and leisure life at home. They're spending a lot of time and effort trying to separate them. And I just wrote a book chapter on remote work for a history of the COVID pandemic. And what I said in the concluding parts of that book chapter was that work-life boundaries are the new commuting. They're the challenge that has replaced commuting now that, you know, a lot of people are at home all of the time. That is the invisible work that we're all faced with. I think, you know, the term invisible work is a really important one because, you know, we kind of like thought it would be some kind of utopian nirvana experience working from home, and that would give us a sense of freedom. But in order to do it really successfully, you have to learn a lot of new skills, you know, so that you are disciplined about, you know, packing up your laptop and your workstation, or walking out of your home office if you're lucky enough to have that much space. You know, that's the, you know, a new conversation that's opened up globally.
Okay, thanks for that. A question here from Radian O'Connor, who runs the RDI lab in the west of Ireland. So any thoughts on the e-residency program in Estonia as a model for the future? Are you familiar with this?
Yeah, I am. So there's
Super.
there's two parts to that. There's e-residency, and there's also been talk about them launching a digital nomad visa, which I think I've seen just before or during lockdown, I think has been launched. So the jury is out on how that is going to play out. I think one of the things that was talked about in terms of the digital nomad visa was that you could get the digital nomad visa and then you get access to the Schengen zone. Now, in light of all of these conversations about borders and border control and Brexit, you know, I really wonder how that is going to, pan out. And I'm not completely up to date in how, you know, they're launching the digital nomad visa. And I think with the e-residency program, it's obviously linked to that, and that has been available for, you know, quite some time. I tried to apply for it myself, and you know, that was quite a fun process. And I know some other people that have applied for it. I think what people are mainly using it for at the moment is a way of, you know, sort of like having a business or registering a business, you know, outside of, you know, the UK or, you know, wherever you're working from. I think it's a really interesting experiment in, you know, the idea that we're going to live in a borderless world. The social scientist Benedict Anderson wrote a book called Imagine Communities. And he basically said, you know, nation states, well, you know, what are they really? They're just kind of like products of the imagination, because nobody ever meets everybody else in that, you know, nation state. So he was just saying that nation states are really just ideas. And I think Estonia is running with that idea. You know, ideologically, I think they're very excited about it there. And, you know, now they're kind of like trying to launch, you know, sort of like tools that people can use. And yeah, let's see how that goes. You know, the conversations in Europe are polarizing somewhat, I think.
Yeah, you mentioned the B word. It's kind of funny how quickly that just went off the, I guess, off the newsreel for a period, and now it's coming back. Yeah. And when we were talking before, Dave, I thought it was really interesting. I kind of said, look, it'd be fantastic to do this, to have a conversation with you like this, because there's a lot of people saying that they're experts on working from home, because now that, you know, and then because there's a lot of people working from home, and you kind of said, well, actually, that kind of does make them experts from working from home. And I thought it was just a very subtle point, but very important point, because I guess everybody, or a lot of people now, do very much have a clear view as to what remote working is about and what working from home is. So I guess, what do you see? So today's the Bastille Day, 14th of July. Mm-hmm. What do you see happening over the next kind of, I guess, 90 days and up until Christmas? Are we largely going to stay in the pattern that we're in? And then do you think businesses are gearing up to this 90% of normality from January 1st?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you're sick of hearing this, but I mean, we're living in a very kind of like fluid situation at the moment. We really don't know, where the virus itself is going to take us. I mean, what I will say is, from the people that I know that are lucky enough to still be working, and let's be clear here. We're talking about quite high class problems here, because so many people have lost their jobs or been furloughed. That's one whole set of inequalities, which I think we have to, mention here. But for those companies where they have white collar workers and people are working from home, a lot of the bigger companies are not, like Twitter and Facebook have said our employees can work from home forever, and they're launching flexible working policies, which is giving those employees a sense of how they're going to plan their lives, whether they're going to leave London or leave San Francisco and live in a log cabin and be able to work that way. A lot of other companies are still evolving their policies. I think I know a lot of people working in tech and media companies, and those larger companies are saying that we don't know when we're going to pull people back to the office. The really famous examples that have come up over the last 10 years have been Yahoo and IBM. So Yahoo, I think it was 2014, pulled everyone back into the office because they kind of wanted to increase productivity, and they wanted to have more control over their workers, let's be honest. Whereas IBM in 2017 brought back their marketing departments back into the office. And the reason why IBM brought people back into the office isn't because they wanted to increase productivity. IBM had actually sponsored academic studies over decades to, they were pioneers of remote work, and they showed actually people were more productive when they were working from home. The reason why they brought people back into the office was because they were losing ground to competitors in cloud computing, and they needed to change the culture and innovation of the company. So they brought the marketing department back to actually change the direction of the entire ship. So that's a slightly more nuanced reason for bringing people back. And what I think is going to happen with companies, each company has its own identity, it has its own culture, and I think we will find different attitudes to remote work emerging over the next few months. But I think white collar workers are going to be working from home for quite a long time. I mean, I haven't, and a lot of companies are also kind of like saying, whatever happens, we're not going to go back to how we were before. We are working towards a much overused phrase, a new normal. And I'm sure there are sort of like think tanks and committees and many large companies that are discussing this right as we speak at the moment.
Okay, and you mentioned earlier the piece of work with around eWork Life. Could you just go into that a little bit more detail if you had a moment?
Yeah, so I found out at the beginning of lockdown that I wasn't the only person studying remote work and work-life boundaries. There was a team at UCL in the UCL Interaction Centre, UCLIC, who were studying work-life balance and all of the strategies, self-regulation strategies that people were using. I did have a connection with that department from about 15 years ago, so I knew some of the people there. And they invited me in and said, come and work with us, let's share our knowledge. Different disciplines within universities don't always work so easily together. But we said, hey, we're going to do this, and it's been great. And so I've been working with some really talented psychologists. We've they were doing a survey whereby they were, collecting data about people's experiences working from home, and then it was giving people tailored recommendations, and people can still go on and do that survey. So if they go to eworklife.co.uk, I think it's /participate, they can actually get involved in the project by going and doing that. And then I help them kick off some qualitative interviews so that we could get real in-depth stories about what people's experience was like during the transition to working from home. And we've now completed the first phase of that, and it's been really heartening, and it's been a real privilege speaking to people at home, obviously via video meeting. And people have been telling me that they've been doing really, really well during lockdown. And what they mean by that, in many cases, is that they're doing better than they expected they would have. But then what I've seen is people being quite contradictory in what they've been saying in interviews. So, on one level, they've been doing well, and then they've kind of like been saying, but this is hard. It's been really hard to manage the boundaries between, sort of like work time and not working. Everything is kind of like all, sort of like merged into an unmanageable mess. There was one person that I interviewed who was working in a flat in South London, and it was a one-bedroom flat, and she was working with her fiance. And it's a quote that she told me, and it just sticks in my head all the time. She said, yeah, I was doing really, really well, but this isn't a good quality existence. And I think that kind of tension in that sentence kind of like sums everything up. I think kind of like people are kind of, they're quite surprised that they're doing so well during this quarantine. But, how people react to that does change over time. So, some weeks people feel that they're doing really well, and then it can feel not so great.
Mm. And in terms of what's next for you, so what's your next focus? You just mentioned you finished that chapter, so congratulations.
Yeah.
So what's next?
Well, the number one priority, or there were quite a few priorities, but one number one priority is just getting my company what people want. Sort of like out of lockdown. We're starting to get busier now. Where we were fully distributed and remote before lockdown, but even a small consultancy like ours that are kind of used to working together. Our team has been working together for more than 15 years. Still found it really, really difficult to sort of like manage everyone's caring responsibilities and and work responsibilities. So we're starting to do more projects now. So it's about sort of getting that off the ground and making sure that everybody is okay and feels supported out of that. And then with the eWork Life project, we are going to go back hopefully to the same people and see what their experience is like, a couple of months down the line. We need to look back at what they were saying 2 months ago, and kind of like see what's happening for them now. And we're going to be publishing more papers and more articles about that. And then beyond that, with the digital nomad study, I've got 5 years worth of data. It was always going to be a 7-year study. So at some point, I've got to get back to Thailand, and I've got to finish the data collection there. And I don't know when that is going to be. Ethically, it's not okay to go, into the field and, do international travel for non-essential research. So that's one of the things that I'm thinking about. But I am very keen to try and understand how, COVID, the pandemic, the quarantine has affected that whole lifestyle, because most of the people that I was, were on my study. Some stayed out, and stayed as nomadic as they could be, and most people went home. So, it's going to be interesting to see how that all impacted on the digital nomad dream.
Okay, thank you for that. And Dave, finally, if people want to, I guess, get in touch or to follow you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn, so I think probably people can follow me there. There is a very poorly designed website, which is about my research, called the nomadproject.org. So people can also kind of like find out what I've been doing there. I update it, not that regularly, but it does tend to get updated from time to time. And people can also go to the eworklife.co.uk page, and it's got all of the people working on that project there, and you can follow the link and they can email me from there as well.
Perfect. Okay, and I have added all of those to the comments so everybody can see those and access them directly. Dave, thank you very much for sharing all that information and fantastic insights, especially based on all your work done to date. And I think it's, I guess, more relevant than ever. So this is these months and the years to come, I guess, are have played very nicely into all your research. And I'm sure you're an individual that's in demand. So a big thank you for your time this evening, and please stay in touch.
Thank you. No one's more surprised than I am.
And modest and humble too. Have a fantastic evening. Cheers, Dave.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.